I was sitting in my home office in Portland, Oregon, going through my grandmother's estate paperwork when my best friend Madison walked out of our guest bathroom holding a bottle of prescription pills. "Emma, why do you have haloperidol in your medicine cabinet?" she asked, reading the label. "This is an antipsychotic medication." I looked up from the documents spread across my desk. Bank statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios worth over $3.2 million that my grandmother had left me 6 months ago. "That's not mine, Madison. I've never taken anything like that." My husband Derek was in the kitchen making his usual Sunday morning pancakes. I could hear the sizzle of batter hitting the pan and smell the vanilla he always added to make them special. "Derek?" I called out. "Do you know anything about antipsychotic medication in our bathroom?" The sizzling stopped. The silence stretched long enough that Madison and I exchanged a look. "There's only 2 people who live here," Madison said quietly, still holding the bottle. Derek appeared in the doorway, flour dusting his navy sweater, his face pale. "It's not what you think." "Then explain what it is," I said, standing up slowly. My legs felt unsteady, like when I'd been having those dizzy spells lately. The ones Derek said were from stress about inheriting so much money so suddenly. Madison was reading the prescription label more carefully. "This is filled every month for the past 8 months. The dosage is pretty high." She looked at me with growing alarm. "Emma, have you been feeling confused lately, having trouble thinking clearly?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I had been feeling confused, foggy, unable to concentrate on simple tasks. I chalked it up to grief over losing Grandma Rose, but now... "The inheritance," I whispered. "Derek, you've been drugging me because of the inheritance." His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "All those times I couldn't remember conversations we'd had," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "When I'd sign documents and forget what they were for. When you said I was getting forgetful and maybe we should set up a joint account just in case something happened to me." Madison was already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling 911. "Please, Emma, let me explain," Derek said, stepping closer. But I backed away, bumping into my desk chair. "Explain how you've been poisoning me to steal my grandmother's money?" The words came out sharp and broken. "How long have you been planning this?" Derek's hands were shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I just needed time to figure out how to handle the inheritance. You were so overwhelmed, and I thought if you were just a little calmer, less anxious about the money." "Calmer?" I was shouting now. "You gave me antipsychotic medication to make me calmer? Do you know what that does to someone who doesn't need it?" Madison was speaking rapidly to the 911 dispatcher, giving our address. I could hear sirens in the distance already. I grabbed the estate paperwork from my desk, scanning through it with new clarity. "The joint bank account you convinced me to set up," I said, my hands trembling as I flipped through pages. "The power of attorney documents you said were just standard paperwork. The life insurance policy you increased last month." Derek was backing toward the kitchen now, his face gray. "You have to understand, Emma. $3 million changes everything. I was trying to protect us." "Protect us from what? From me being able to think clearly enough to make my own decisions about my own inheritance?" The sirens were getting louder. Through our front window, I could see red and blue lights flashing. "How much have you already taken?" I demanded, following him toward the kitchen. "How much of my grandmother's money is already gone?" Derek's back hit the counter. "I haven't taken anything yet. I swear. I was just preparing. Preparing to have me declared mentally incompetent," I said, the full scope of his plan becoming clear. "That's why you kept suggesting I see a doctor about my memory problems. You were going to use the medication to make me seem mentally ill so you could control the inheritance." Madison appeared beside me. "The police are here." The front door exploded open, and 3 officers rushed in with their hands on their weapons. "Police, we received a report of domestic violence and possible poisoning." Derek's eyes went wide with panic. Before anyone could react, he was sprinting toward the back door. One officer shouted, "Stop!" But Derek was already crashing through our sliding glass door onto the deck. I pointed in his direction while trying to explain what happened to the remaining officers. But the words came out jumbled. The medication was still affecting my ability to think clearly, even though I now knew what was causing it. Madison took over, showing the officers the prescription bottle and explaining how she'd found it. One officer immediately called for a crime scene team and evidence bags. Within minutes, paramedics were checking my vital signs and asking about symptoms I'd been experiencing. My blood pressure was dangerously low, and they said the medication could have caused serious heart problems if Derek had continued dosing me. "How were you getting the medication into her system?" one of the officers asked Madison, since I was still too shaky to answer coherently. "Probably in her coffee," Madison said, looking at me with tears in her eyes. "You always drink that special blend Derek makes for you every morning." The coffee. Derek's special Sunday morning ritual of bringing me coffee in bed, insisting I drink it all because he'd made it with love. the bitter taste I'd learned to ignore because he seemed so proud of his brewing technique. They took me to the hospital for blood work to determine how much of the drug was in my system and for how long I'd been receiving it. The tests would take hours, but the doctor said, based on my symptoms, I'd likely been consistently drugged for months. While waiting for results, Detective Sarah Caldwell arrived to take my statement. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had clearly seen too much. "Mrs. Richardson, I need you to walk me through everything you remember about the past few months," she said, setting up a recording device. "Start with when your grandmother passed away and you inherited her estate." I told her about Grandma Rose dying in February, leaving me her house in Lake Oswego, her investment portfolio, and nearly $800,000 in cash. How Derek had immediately started talking about managing the windfall responsibly and setting up joint accounts for our future. "Did your husband show unusual interest in the inheritance?" Detective Caldwell asked. "He became obsessed with it," I realized as I spoke. "He wanted to know every detail about every account, every property, every investment. He said it was because he wanted to help me manage it all, but he started making decisions without asking me." I told her about the insurance policy Derek had increased from $100,000 to $500,000 just last month, claiming it was smart financial planning now that we had so much to protect. "And when did you start experiencing the symptoms you now know were from the medication?" "About 8 months ago, but they got much worse after Grandma died. I thought it was grief, but Derek kept suggesting maybe I should see a doctor about early onset dementia or Alzheimer's." Detective Caldwell's pen stopped moving. "He wanted you evaluated for dementia?" "He made appointments for me with neurologists, said he was worried about my mental state, and thought I might need help managing my affairs." The full horror of it was sinking in. He was going to use the medication to create symptoms that would make doctors think I was mentally incompetent. "And then, as your husband, he could petition for guardianship and control of your assets," the detective finished grimly. My blood work came back showing dangerously high levels of haloperidol in my system. The doctor explained that the dosage I'd been receiving could have caused permanent neurological damage if it had continued much longer. "Someone with knowledge of psychiatric medications planned this very carefully," she said. "The dosing was precise enough to cause cognitive impairment without putting you in immediate physical danger." Detective Caldwell took notes while the doctor spoke. "Mrs. Richardson, does your husband have medical training or access to psychiatric medications?" "He works as a pharmaceutical sales representative," I said, the pieces clicking together. "He specializes in psychiatric drugs for elderly patients with dementia." The detective and doctor exchanged a meaningful look. "That explains the specific medication and dosing," Detective Caldwell said. "He chose a drug he understood and knew how to administer without killing you immediately." Over the next several hours, more details emerged that painted an even darker picture. When they searched our house, officers found a hidden safe in Derek's home office containing documents I'd supposedly signed but had no memory of signing. There was a new will naming Derek as the sole beneficiary of my entire inheritance. Power of attorney documents giving him complete control over my finances. Applications for long-term care insurance that would pay for my treatment in a facility. Most disturbing was a notebook in Derek's handwriting detailing his plan week by week. Month 1 to 3, establish pattern of confusion and memory loss. Month 4 to 6, increased dosage, document incidents. Month 7 to 9, medical evaluations, competency questions. Month 10-12, guardianship petition, asset transfer. I was apparently in month 8 of his timeline. They also found evidence that Derek had been researching facilities for people with early onset dementia, specifically ones that were expensive and would quickly drain the inheritance he was planning to control. Detective Caldwell explained that this type of financial abuse was more common than people realized, especially when large inheritances were involved. Spouses, family members, even caregivers will slowly poison victims to create the appearance of mental illness, then use that to gain control of assets. Derek was caught trying to board a flight to Costa Rica using a passport I didn't know he had. Apparently, he'd been planning an escape route for months, probably in case I figured out what he was doing before he could complete his plan. The booking photo they showed me looked nothing like the man I'd married 4 years earlier. His eyes were wild and desperate, and he'd clearly been living rough since fleeing our house. At the bail hearing, Derek's lawyer argued that he was just trying to help me manage a complicated inheritance and that my accusations were the result of mental illness. The irony was staggering, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor had the medical records showing dangerous levels of antipsychotic medication in my system, the notebook detailing Derek's plan, the forged documents, and security footage from our home showing Derek tampering with my coffee maker. Bail was set at $250,000, which Derek couldn't make from jail. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, medical appointments, and trying to piece together how much damage Derek had already done to my finances and my health. My lawyer, Robert Chen, discovered that Derek had already transferred $180,000 from the inheritance into accounts I couldn't access. He'd used the power of attorney documents I'd signed while heavily medicated to make the transfers appear legal. The good news is we can reverse most of this, Robert explained during one of our meetings. The bad news is it's going to take months, maybe years, to untangle everything he did. The doctors were more cautiously optimistic about my physical recovery. The neurologist, Dr. Martinez, ran extensive tests to check for permanent damage from the psychiatric medication. "You're lucky your friend found that bottle when she did," Dr. Martinez said, reviewing my brain scans. A few more months at those dosage levels could have caused irreversible cognitive impairment. I was already starting to think more clearly as the medication left my system, but some effects lingered. I still had trouble concentrating for long periods and occasionally felt confused or disoriented. The hardest part was accepting how thoroughly Derek had manipulated me. I kept thinking about conversations we'd had where I'd felt stupid or confused, and he'd been so patient and understanding, gently suggesting maybe I should let him handle the complicated financial stuff. He'd even convinced me to stop working, claiming the inheritance meant I didn't need the stress of my job as a graphic designer. Without my own income, I'd been completely dependent on him for everything, including information about our finances. Madison stayed with me through those first few weeks, helping me navigate the legal and medical appointments. She'd taken time off work and refused to leave me alone, even sleeping on my couch most nights. "I should have realized something was wrong," she kept saying. "You hadn't been yourself for months, but I thought you were just grieving." He fooled everyone, I assured her. Even doctors who saw me thought the symptoms were psychological. The investigation revealed more disturbing details about Derek's planning. Police found he'd been researching my family's medical history, looking for hereditary conditions he could use to support claims of mental illness. He'd also been secretly recording our conversations, probably planning to use them as evidence of my confusion and irrational behavior in competency hearings. Detective Caldwell said they found dozens of hours of recordings where Derek would ask me leading questions designed to make me sound disoriented, then offer to handle whatever I was confused about. "He was essentially gaslighting you while you were being medicated," she explained, creating a record that would support his claims about your mental state. The prosecutor, James Morrison, was building charges that included attempted murder, fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Even though I was only 34, the financial exploitation laws applied because of the inheritance and my artificially impaired mental state. "This is one of the most premeditated cases of financial abuse I've seen," Morrison told me during a meeting to discuss the charges. "Your husband created a sophisticated plan to slowly destroy your mental capacity while stealing your inheritance." The trial was set for 8 months away, which meant 8 more months of reliving this nightmare through depositions, evidence review, and testimony preparation. Meanwhile, I had to rebuild my entire life. The house felt contaminated with memories of Derek's deception, so I put it on the market and moved into a downtown Portland apartment with better security. I started working with a therapist, Dr. Helen Walsh, who specialized in trauma from intimate partner abuse. She helped me understand that what Derek did was a form of psychological torture designed to make me doubt my own reality. Victims of this type of abuse often struggle with self-trust for years afterward, Dr. Walsh explained. "You were systematically made to feel incompetent and confused, so rebuilding confidence in your own judgment takes time." The hardest sessions were when we talked about signs I might have missed. Dr. Walsh helped me see that Derek's behavior had been escalating gradually, so each new level of control seemed like a natural progression, rather than abuse. He'd started by offering to help with small financial decisions, then gradually took over more aspects of my life while I was grieving and feeling overwhelmed by the inheritance. "Abusers are skilled at finding vulnerable moments," Dr. Walsh said. "Your grief over your grandmother made you an ideal target for someone wanting to exploit your inheritance." 6 months after Derek's arrest, I was finally stable enough to return to work part-time. My boss at the design agency had held my position open, understanding that I'd been the victim of a serious crime. But concentrating on creative work was difficult. The medication had affected my visual processing and fine motor skills, making it hard to do the detailed graphic design work I'd always loved. My colleagues were supportive, but clearly didn't know how to act around me. I could see them whispering and wondering how someone doesn't notice they're being drugged by their husband for months. I wondered the same thing. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that the medication itself had impaired my ability to recognize what was happening. You can't think clearly about being poisoned when the poison is specifically designed to impair thinking. The isolation was the worst part. Derek had gradually cut me off from most of my friends, claiming they were jealous of my inheritance or bad influences who might take advantage of me. By the time Madison found the medication, I had very few people left in my life besides Derek. He'd become my primary source of information about everything, from my own health to our finances. Madison helped me reconnect with friends I'd lost touch with, but explaining what had happened was exhausting. Most people were horrified, but clearly didn't know what to say or how to help. Some well-meaning friends suggested I should just move on and focus on the positive now that Derek was in jail. They didn't understand that the effects of months of psychological manipulation and medication don't just disappear when the abuse stops. The legal process dragged on with delays and continuances. Derek's lawyer kept filing motions claiming I was mentally ill and fabricating the abuse allegations. They even tried to argue that I had been taking the medication voluntarily and didn't remember because of my supposed mental health issues. But the evidence was too strong. The security footage showing Derek tampering with my coffee, the notebook detailing his plan, the forged documents, the timeline of medication refills matching my symptoms. Robert Chen filed civil suits against Derek for the stolen money, the forged documents, and emotional distress. But as he warned me from the beginning, getting money back from someone facing criminal charges was unlikely. Even if we win judgments, he'll probably spend years in prison with no income or assets to collect from, Robert explained. The inheritance that was supposed to provide financial security had become the center of a legal nightmare that was costing me thousands in legal fees and medical expenses. During this time, I also discovered Derek had been living a double life in ways I never imagined. When police searched his work computer, they found he'd been embezzling from his pharmaceutical company for over a year, skimming samples and selling them on the black market. His coworkers came forward with stories about Derek's increasingly erratic behavior at work. He'd been missing meetings, failing to meet sales targets, and making inappropriate comments about stupid rich people who don't deserve their money. One colleague, Janet Morrison, told investigators that Derek had asked detailed questions about psychiatric medications and their effects on cognitive function, claiming it was for a sales presentation. She'd found it odd because Derek usually worked with different types of drugs. He kept asking about dosages that would cause confusion but not obvious psychosis, Janet reported. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough, but now it makes perfect sense. The company had been planning to fire Derek the week after his arrest for the embezzlement, which added federal charges to his already extensive criminal case. Detective Caldwell theorized that Derek's financial desperation from his work problems had accelerated his timeline for stealing my inheritance. He was under pressure from multiple directions: his job, his debts, and probably other financial obligations we haven't discovered yet. Indeed, further investigation revealed that Derek had been gambling heavily online, losing thousands of dollars on sports betting and casino games. Credit card statements showed charges at local casinos, online poker sites, and various gambling apps. He'd accumulated over $80,000 in gambling debts to various creditors, some of whom were not the type to accept late payments gracefully. Police found threatening messages on Derek's phone from people demanding repayment. Your inheritance wasn't just an opportunity for him, Detective Caldwell explained. It was a lifeline. He was desperate. This context made Derek's actions even more chilling. He hadn't just been greedy. He'd been panicked and willing to destroy my mental health to save himself from his own failures. The medical experts brought in for the case painted an even more disturbing picture of what Derek had been doing to me. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a forensic psychiatrist, reviewed all my medical records and the evidence of Derek's plan. What makes this case particularly egregious is the calculated nature of the abuse, Dr. Hendricks explained during a deposition. The defendant didn't just give his wife random medications. He researched the specific effects he wanted to achieve and titrated the dosage to create symptoms that would support his narrative of mental decline. She explained that Derek had chosen haloperidol specifically because it would cause cognitive symptoms that could be mistaken for early-onset dementia or other psychiatric conditions. The dosage was carefully calculated to impair my thinking without causing obvious physical symptoms that might alarm doctors immediately. If this had continued for another few months, Emma would likely have been declared incompetent and possibly institutionalized, Dr. Hendricks testified. The long-term effects could have included permanent neurological damage, tardive dyskinesia, and severe cognitive impairment. The prosecution brought in other experts who testified about the rarity and sophistication of Derek's crime. Dr. Michael Torres, a toxicologist, explained that most poisoning cases involve readily available substances like rat poison or household chemicals. What we see here is someone with professional knowledge using controlled substances in a methodical way to achieve specific psychological effects, Dr. Torres said. This required planning, research, and access to medications that aren't easily obtained. The defense team tried to argue that Derek's actions were motivated by genuine concern for my mental health, rather than greed. They brought in their own psychiatric expert who suggested that Derek might have believed he was helping me manage anxiety and depression related to the inheritance. But this argument fell apart when prosecutors introduced evidence of Derek's financial research. Police had found detailed notes in Derek's handwriting, calculating exactly how much money he could access through various legal mechanisms once I was declared incompetent. He'd researched guardianship laws, looked into the costs of long-term psychiatric care, and even contacted lawyers about the process for having someone declared mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. Most damning was a spreadsheet Derek had created showing projected monthly expenses for keeping me in a psychiatric facility compared to the income he could generate by investing my inheritance. He'd calculated that he could maintain me in institutional care while still having over $200,000 per year for his own use. The spreadsheet included line items for facility costs, legal fees, and personal expenses, treating my institutionalization as just another business expense in his plan to steal my inheritance. A year after Madison found that prescription bottle, I was finally ready to testify at Derek's trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters covering what had become known as the inheritance poisoning case. Taking the stand was terrifying. Derek sat at the defense table in a suit I'd bought him for our anniversary, looking nothing like the desperate man in his booking photo. His lawyer tried to paint me as a mentally unstable woman who had convinced herself she was being poisoned when she was actually taking medication for legitimate psychological issues. But when the prosecutor played recordings Derek had made of our conversations, the manipulation was obvious. You could hear him asking leading questions, then offering to handle whatever I was confused about. The most damning evidence was Derek's notebook, which the prosecutor read aloud to the jury. Month by month, Derek had documented his plan to drug me into compliance while stealing my inheritance. Month 8, the prosecutor read, Emma showing significant cognitive decline. Scheduled appointment with neurologist to document mental incapacity. Timeline moving ahead of schedule. Derek's face went white as his own handwriting was read back to him. The defense called character witnesses who testified about Derek's reputation in the community and his apparent devotion to me during our marriage. His mother, Patricia Richardson, took the stand and sobbed while describing Derek as a loving husband who had always taken care of his family. Derek would never hurt Emma, she insisted. He loved her more than anything. This whole thing is just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. But during cross-examination, the prosecutor revealed that Patricia had called Derek multiple times during the weeks before his arrest, asking when he would be taking care of the Emma situation, and whether she would be getting the money she'd loaned him for his gambling debts. Phone records showed that Patricia had been pressuring Derek to access my inheritance to repay family loans, totaling over $30,000. In one recorded conversation, she'd suggested that maybe I wasn't capable of handling all that money, and Derek should do what needs to be done. The jury listened with obvious disgust, as Patricia's own words contradicted her testimony about Derek's noble motives. Derek's sister, Michelle Richardson, also testified for the defense, claiming that I had seemed confused and paranoid during family gatherings, and that Derek was just trying to get me help. But prosecutors played security footage from those same family gatherings, showing Derek discreetly adding powder to my drinks while engaging in normal conversation. The timestamp showed this happening at Christmas dinner, during Michelle's own birthday party, and at other family events. When confronted with the video evidence, Michelle broke down on the stand and admitted she'd seen Derek tampering with my drinks, but had assumed it was vitamins or supplements he was giving me for my health. The defense's case completely collapsed when the prosecutor called Derek's former coworker, Dr. Patricia Kim, who had unknowingly provided Derek with information about psychiatric medications. Dr. Kim testified that Derek had approached her multiple times asking detailed questions about haloperidol and other antipsychotic medications, claiming he needed the information for presentations to physicians. He asked very specific questions about dosing, side effects, and how the medications would affect someone who didn't have a psychiatric condition, Dr. Kim testified. He wanted to know exactly how much would cause confusion without causing obvious psychosis. She'd found Derek's questions odd, but hadn't thought to report them because he was a pharmaceutical sales representative who often asked about different medications. He asked me what would happen if someone gave these medications to a person without mental illness, Dr. Kim said. I told him it would cause cognitive impairment, confusion, and difficulty making decisions. He asked if it would be permanent, and I explained that it depended on the dosage and duration. The prosecutor asked Dr. Kim if she now realized Derek had been planning to use this information to harm someone. Obviously, yes, Dr. Kim replied. He wasn't asking for educational purposes. He was researching how to poison someone. Derek's lawyer tried to salvage the defense by suggesting that Derek had been suffering from gambling addiction and financial stress that impaired his judgment. They brought in an addiction counselor who testified about the psychological effects of gambling disorders. But this strategy backfired when the prosecution used Derek's gambling problem to establish his motive for stealing my inheritance. Financial desperation didn't excuse systematic poisoning. It explained why he'd been willing to go to such extreme lengths. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: attempted murder, aggravated assault, fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Derek showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead while I wept with relief in the gallery. During the sentencing phase, I read my victim impact statement describing how Derek's actions had affected every aspect of my life. "You didn't just steal money," I told Derek, looking directly at him for the first time since his arrest. "You stole my sense of reality, my trust in my own mind, my ability to make decisions about my own life." I described the ongoing effects of the poisoning, the memory problems, the difficulty concentrating, the panic attacks that struck without warning. I talked about the therapy sessions where I learned to trust my own perceptions again, the medical appointments to monitor for permanent damage, the legal battles to recover stolen assets. "You took away 2 years of my life while you poisoned me," I said. "But your actions will affect me for the rest of my life. Every decision I make, every relationship I form, will be shadowed by what you did to me." Derek looked down at his hands and said nothing. Other victims of Derek's crimes also testified. His former employer described the financial damage from his embezzlement and the betrayal of trust that had affected their entire organization. Janet Morrison, Derek's former coworker, talked about the guilt she felt for unknowingly providing information Derek used to poison me. "I feel responsible for what happened to Emma," she said. "If I had reported Derek's suspicious questions, maybe none of this would have happened." Derek's gambling creditors didn't testify, but their impact was felt through evidence of the threats Derek had received and the desperate situation that had motivated his crimes. The judge sentenced Derek to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. The sentence reflected the premeditated nature of his crimes and the sophistication of his plan to destroy my mental capacity. "Mr. Richardson, you committed one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes I have seen in 30 years on the bench," Judge Elizabeth Martinez said during sentencing. "You systematically poisoned your wife over many months with the specific intent of rendering her mentally incompetent so you could steal her inheritance." Judge Martinez noted that Derek had shown no remorse and had continued to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. "Your actions demonstrate a level of callousness and manipulation that poses a continuing danger to society." The civil suits were more complicated. We recovered about $120,000 of the money Derek had stolen, but legal fees ate up most of it. The emotional distress damages were set at $2.3 million, but Derek had no assets to pay the judgment. Robert Chen explained that we could garnish any future income Derek might earn after his release from prison, but realistically, we'd never see most of the money. "The important thing is the criminal conviction," Robert said. "Derek will spend the next 15 to 25 years in prison, and when he gets out, he'll be a convicted felon with no access to pharmaceutical sales or any job that requires handling controlled substances." Derek's pharmaceutical company also faced consequences. The DEA investigated how Derek had been able to steal controlled substances and use them to poison me. The company's security protocols were found to be inadequate, resulting in substantial fines and new regulations for pharmaceutical sales representatives. Dr. Patricia Kim, who had unknowingly provided Derek with information about psychiatric medications, left the pharmaceutical industry entirely and now works in medical research, where she doesn't have access to controlled substances. 2 years after the trial, I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The medication had been completely out of my system for over a year, and my cognitive function had mostly returned to normal. The neurological testing showed some permanent effects, slight difficulties with short-term memory and occasional problems with executive function, but nothing that significantly impacted my daily life. Dr. Martinez, my neurologist, explained that I'd been incredibly lucky. Another few months of that level of medication exposure could have caused permanent disability, she said during one of my follow-up appointments. "Your friend Madison literally saved your life by finding that prescription bottle when she did." I'd started dating again, though explaining my history was always difficult. How do you tell someone that your husband spent months drugging you to steal your inheritance without sounding like you have terrible judgment about people? My current boyfriend, Marcus, is a social worker who specializes in elder abuse cases. He understands the dynamics of financial exploitation and doesn't judge me for being a victim of such sophisticated manipulation. "What Derek did to you is more common than people realize," Marcus told me early in our relationship. The fact that it happened to someone young and educated just shows how skilled these predators can be. Dr. Walsh, my therapist, helped me work through the shame and self-blame that came with being a victim of such calculated abuse. You trusted someone you loved, she reminded me regularly. That's not a character flaw. It's what healthy people do in relationships. The therapy sessions focused on rebuilding my ability to trust my own judgment and recognize red flags in relationships. Dr. Walsh taught me about the gradual nature of abuse and how perpetrators use incremental control to normalize their behavior. Derek didn't start by drugging you, she explained. He started by being helpful, then gradually took over more decisions, isolated you from friends, and made you financially dependent. The poisoning was just the final step in a long process of control. I'd also started volunteering with an organization that helped elderly victims of financial abuse. My case had gotten attention because of my age and the sophistication of Derek's plan, but most victims were older adults being exploited by family members or caregivers. The patterns were always similar: gradual isolation, systematic undermining of the victim's confidence, increasing control over finances and medical decisions, and often medication to create or worsen confusion. Working with other survivors helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't unique, just unusually well documented, because Madison had found the evidence before Derek could complete his plan. One client, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, was an 82-year-old widow whose son had been stealing from her for years while convincing her she had dementia. Like Derek, her son had been using medication to create confusion and memory problems. My son told me I was losing my mind, Mrs. Patterson said during one of our support group meetings. He said I was forgetting things and making poor decisions with money. I believed him because he was my son. Her story was heartbreakingly similar to mine, just with different details. Her son had convinced her to sign power of attorney documents, moved her to an expensive assisted living facility, and began systematically draining her accounts. Unlike me, Mrs. Patterson didn't have a Madison to find the evidence. By the time anyone realized what was happening, her son had stolen over $400,000, and her cognitive function had been permanently impaired by months of unnecessary psychiatric medication. At least you got justice, Mrs. Patterson told me. My son only got probation and community service. The judge said it was a family matter that got out of hand. Hearing stories like Mrs. Patterson's made me realize how fortunate I'd been, despite everything Derek had put me through. The evidence in my case had been overwhelming, the prosecution had been competent, and the judge had understood the severity of Derek's crimes. Many victims of financial abuse never see justice, either because the evidence is destroyed or because law enforcement doesn't understand the sophisticated nature of these crimes. 3 years later, I was living in a house I'd bought with what remained of Grandma Rose's inheritance. I'd chosen it specifically because it had no memories of Derek and was in a neighborhood where no one knew my story. The house was a modest craftsman bungalow in southeast Portland, with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. I'd taken up gardening as part of my recovery, finding that working with soil and plants helped ground me when anxiety or memories became overwhelming. I'd returned to graphic design full-time and even started taking on freelance projects that challenged me creatively in ways I hadn't felt capable of when I was being medicated. My work had evolved during my recovery. I'd started specializing in designs for nonprofit organizations, particularly those focused on domestic violence prevention and elder abuse awareness. One project involved creating educational materials about financial exploitation for the organization where I volunteered. The brochures and posters I designed helped other potential victims recognize the warning signs that I'd missed in my own relationship. Madison and I remained. The anniversary of finding the medication always hit me hard, but I'd learned to prepare for it. I took time off work, stayed close to my support system, and reminded myself that I'd survived something designed to destroy me. Derek had tried to steal not just my inheritance, but my mind, my autonomy, and my future. Instead, his plan had exposed him and landed him in prison while I rebuilt my life stronger than before. The inheritance that had made me a target also gave me resources to get the best medical care, legal representation, and therapy to recover from his abuse. Grandma Rose had always said money was just a tool. It was how you used it that mattered. I used it to rebuild my life and help other victims of financial abuse. Derek used it as motivation to commit crimes that would destroy his life and freedom. In the end, justice prevailed, but the scars remained. I still sometimes doubted my own perceptions or second-guessed decisions in ways I never had before Derek's manipulation. But I was alive, free, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me rather than what they could steal from me. The inheritance that nearly destroyed my life had ultimately saved it, giving me the resources to fight back and the foundation to build something better. 4 years later, I was stronger, wiser, and more careful about trust. But I hadn't let Derek's betrayal turn me into someone who couldn't love or be vulnerable with the right people. That felt like the real victory, not just surviving his attempt to destroy me, but emerging from it, still capable of human connection and joy. Marcus and I had been talking about moving in together, a conversation that would have been impossible 2 years earlier, when I couldn't trust anyone with even basic decisions about my life. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Dr. Walsh asked during one of our sessions. Living with someone again might trigger memories of Derek's control. I'd thought about it extensively. The difference was that Marcus respected my autonomy, encouraged my independence, and had never shown any interest in my financial situation beyond normal relationship discussions about shared expenses. Derek tried to make me helpless so he could control me, I told Dr. Walsh. Marcus encourages me to be strong and make my own decisions. That's how I know the difference. We'd been together for over a year, and I'd watched carefully for any signs of the control patterns Derek had used. Marcus had never pressured me to give him access to my accounts, never suggested I was incompetent to handle my own affairs, and actively supported my work with abuse survivors. When I'd told Marcus about my inheritance and Derek's crimes, his first response had been concern for my well-being, not curiosity about the money. He'd asked about my recovery, my therapy, and whether there was anything he could do to support me. "That inheritance has caused you so much pain," he'd said. "I hope you're able to find some peace with it eventually." Derek's response to learning about the inheritance had been immediate interest in managing it, controlling it, and ultimately stealing it. The contrast was clear. I'd also learned to recognize my own warning signs, the subtle ways Derek had begun isolating me from friends, making me doubt my judgment, and increasing his control over my daily life. Those patterns would never get past me again. Dr. Walsh agreed that I seemed ready to take the next step with Marcus, but suggested we maintain regular therapy sessions to monitor my adjustment to living with someone again. "Trauma recovery isn't linear," she reminded me. "You might have reactions you don't expect, and that's completely normal." 5 years after Madison found that prescription bottle, I was packing boxes to move in with Marcus when I received a call from the Department of Corrections. Derek was up for his first parole hearing. My stomach dropped. I knew this day would eventually come, but I'd hoped it would be years away. "Mrs. Richardson, you have the right to submit a victim impact statement and attend the hearing if you choose," the parole officer explained. "The board will consider your input when making their decision." I spent the next week debating whether to participate. Part of me wanted Derek to remain in prison forever, but another part wanted to move forward without looking back. I discussed it with Dr. Walsh, Marcus, and Madison. Everyone supported whatever decision I made, but Marcus offered a perspective that helped clarify my thinking. "This isn't about Derek anymore," he said. "It's about you having a voice in the process and making sure the parole board understands the full impact of what he did." I decided to write a victim impact statement, but not attend the hearing in person. I didn't want to see Derek again, but I wanted the parole board to understand the ongoing effects of his crimes. In my statement, I described the permanent neurological effects of the poisoning, the ongoing challenges with trust and decision-making, and the years of therapy required to rebuild my sense of reality. I also wrote about the other victims, Mrs. Patterson and others who hadn't been as fortunate as me in getting justice or recovering from their abuse. Derek Richardson is a sophisticated predator who spent months systematically destroying my mental capacity to steal my inheritance. I wrote, his crimes weren't impulsive mistakes. They were calculated acts of cruelty that required extensive planning and complete disregard for my well-being. I emphasized that Derek had shown no remorse and had maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. Someone who refuses to acknowledge the harm they've caused poses a continuing danger to vulnerable people. The parole board denied Derek's request for early release. According to the letter I received, they cited the premeditated nature of his crimes, his lack of remorse, and the ongoing impact on victims. Derek would remain in prison for at least another 5 years before becoming eligible for parole again. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness when I read the decision. Relief that I wouldn't have to worry about Derek being released while I was still healing, but sadness that this chapter of my life still wasn't fully closed. Closure isn't something that happens to you, Dr. Walsh explained when I shared these feelings. It's something you create for yourself. Derek will always be part of your story, but he doesn't have to control how that story ends. Moving in with Marcus marked a new chapter in my recovery. For the first time since finding that prescription bottle, I was making a major life decision based on hope rather than fear. The house we chose together was bright and open, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. I'd grown to appreciate transparency and visibility after living through Derek's deception and secrecy. Marcus understood my need for financial independence and insisted we keep our accounts separate while sharing household expenses fairly. He'd seen how Derek's financial control had been part of his abuse strategy. "I want you to always know you can take care of yourself," Marcus said when we discussed living arrangements, "Your independence isn't something I ever want to threaten." 6 months into living together, I realized I'd stopped checking my bank accounts obsessively and no longer felt the need to hide financial information from Marcus the way I'd learned to hide things from Derek. The difference was that Marcus had never given me reason to feel defensive about my money or my decisions. He celebrated my successes at work, supported my volunteer activities, and showed genuine pride in my recovery journey. When the 7th anniversary of Derek's crimes approached, I decided to mark it differently. Instead of taking time off work to manage the difficult emotions, I organized a fundraiser for the domestic violence organization where I volunteered. The event raised over $15,000 for victim services, turning the anniversary of my victimization into a day that helped other survivors. It felt like reclaiming that date from Derek and giving it new meaning. Marcus helped organize the fundraiser, using his connections in the social work community to promote the event and recruit volunteers. He understood that helping other victims was an important part of my healing process. "You've turned something terrible into a way to help people," he said the night of the fundraiser. "That takes incredible strength." Looking around the room full of people supporting abuse survivors, I realized Derek's plan had ultimately backfired completely. Instead of making me helpless and isolated, his crimes had connected me with a community of survivors and advocates working to prevent others from experiencing similar abuse. The money he'd tried to steal was now funding services for victims. The isolation he'd imposed on me had been replaced by meaningful relationships built on mutual respect and support. Even the cognitive effects of his poisoning had led me to specialize in creating accessible materials for people with disabilities, expanding my skills as a designer and giving my work deeper purpose. Derek had tried to destroy me to get my inheritance, but instead he'd helped me discover strength I never knew I had, and connected me with work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. 8 years later, Marcus and I were married in a small ceremony attended by Madison, my therapy group, and colleagues from the domestic violence organization. Derek's family wasn't invited. They'd continued to blame me for his imprisonment and maintain that his crimes were somehow my fault. The wedding was everything my first marriage hadn't been: transparent, joyful, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about both of us. Marcus's vows included a promise to support my independence and never make me question my own judgment. "I promise to be your partner, not your manager," he said, a reference to Derek's pattern of taking over my decisions and treating me like I was incompetent. My vows included gratitude for Marcus's patience during my recovery and his understanding of why trust came slowly for me. "You waited while I learned to trust myself again," I said, "and you never tried to rush or control that process." Dr. Walsh attended the wedding and later told me she'd never seen a survivor of such severe abuse reach a place of such genuine happiness and security. "You've rebuilt not just your life, but your ability to be vulnerable with someone who deserves that trust," she said. "That's the opposite of what Derek tried to achieve." 10 years after Madison found that prescription bottle, I was sitting in a courtroom for Derek's second parole hearing. This time I chose to attend in person, bringing Marcus and Madison for support. Derek looked older and grayer, wearing the same orange jumpsuit I remembered from his trial. He'd spent a decade in prison, and it showed in his posture and expression. During his statement to the parole board, Derek finally admitted to his crimes and expressed what sounded like genuine remorse. He'd completed addiction counseling, participated in rehabilitation programs, and claimed to understand the severity of his actions. "I destroyed the person I was supposed to love and protect," he said, glancing briefly in my direction. "I poisoned Emma for money, and there's no excuse for that." It was the first time I'd heard him acknowledge what he'd actually done. The parole board asked me to speak, and I stood up with the statement I'd prepared. "Derek Richardson stole 2 years of my life through systematic poisoning," I said, "but his crimes led me to discover strength I never knew I had, work that gives my life meaning, and relationships built on genuine respect rather than control." I looked directly at Derek while I spoke. "I don't forgive you for what you did, but I'm no longer defined by it. You tried to make me helpless, and instead you helped me learn how strong I really am." The parole board granted Derek's release with strict conditions: supervised parole for 5 years, no contact with me or my family, mandatory addiction counseling, and prohibition from working in any field involving access to controlled substances or vulnerable populations. Derek would be released in 3 months to a halfway house in another state. I felt surprisingly calm when I heard the decision. Derek's release didn't frighten me the way I'd expected it might. I was no longer the confused, isolated woman he'd victimized. I had a strong support system, financial security, and the knowledge to recognize and resist manipulation. "How do you feel about him getting out?" Madison asked as we left the courthouse. "I feel sorry for him," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of that answer. He threw away his life and spent a decade in prison for money he never even got to enjoy. I rebuilt my life and found happiness he tried to steal from me. Derek's release marked the end of one chapter of my recovery, but not the end of my growth. I continued working with abuse survivors, expanding the organization's programs, and helping more people recognize the signs of financial exploitation. The inheritance that had nearly destroyed my life continued to fund services for other victims. Grandma Rose's money was helping people rebuild their lives after similar betrayals, which felt like the best possible use of her legacy. Marcus and I started talking about having children, a conversation that would have been impossible when I was still struggling with the effects of Derek's poisoning. The idea of creating life rather than having it destroyed felt like the ultimate victory over Derek's attempts to control my future. "Are you sure you're ready?" Dr. Walsh asked during one of our quarterly check-ins. "Pregnancy and parenting will bring up new vulnerabilities." I'd thought about it extensively. The difference was that I would be choosing to become vulnerable with someone who had spent years proving his trustworthiness, rather than having vulnerability forced on me by someone who exploited it. Derek tried to destroy my ability to trust and make decisions, I told Dr. Walsh. Having a child with Marcus is the ultimate proof that I've reclaimed both of those things. 15 years after Derek's arrest, I was holding my 6-month-old daughter while speaking to a group of financial advisors about recognizing signs of elder abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek's crimes had made me an expert in the field he'd tried to exploit. My daughter, Rose, named after my grandmother, slept peacefully in my arms while I described the sophisticated methods predators use to gain control over their victims' finances and decision-making abilities. The victim in cases like these often doesn't realize what's happening until significant damage has been done, I explained to the audience. The perpetrator uses the victim's trust and affection to gradually increase control while isolating them from potential sources of help. After my presentation, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My mother has been acting confused lately, and my brother has been pushing her to sign financial documents," she said. "I thought she might be developing dementia, but after hearing your story, I'm wondering if something else is happening." I gave her resources for investigating potential financial abuse and encouraged her to trust her instincts about her brother's behavior. "The most important thing is to believe your mother's capacity to make decisions unless there's clear evidence of cognitive decline from a medical professional," I told her. "Don't let anyone convince you she's incompetent just because they want to control her finances." 6 months later, the woman contacted me to report that her brother had been stealing from their mother and using sleeping medication to make her seem confused during meetings with lawyers and financial advisors. The mother was now safe, the money was being recovered, and the brother was facing criminal charges. "Your presentation saved my mother from losing everything," she wrote in her thank you note. "Thank you for turning your trauma into a way to help other families." Letters like that reminded me why Derek's crimes, terrible as they were, had ultimately led me to work that felt more meaningful than anything I could have imagined. Derek's attempt to destroy my life had instead connected me with a community of survivors and advocates working to prevent others from experiencing similar abuse. The inheritance he'd tried to steal was funding services that helped hundreds of people rebuild their lives after betrayal by people they trusted. Even the neurological effects of his poisoning had led me to develop expertise in creating accessible materials for people with cognitive disabilities, making me better at my work and more empathetic toward people facing challenges similar to what I'd experienced. Marcus often said that Derek had inadvertently led me to my true calling. While I wouldn't choose to go through that experience again, I couldn't deny that it had shaped me into someone stronger and more purposeful than I'd been before. "You took something terrible and made it into something that helps people," Marcus said one evening while we watched Rose play with her toys. That's the opposite of what Derek tried to do. Derek had tried to use my inheritance to fund his selfish desires while destroying my capacity to make my own decisions. Instead, I'd used the remaining inheritance to fund services for other victims while becoming an expert in recognizing and preventing financial exploitation. The contrast felt like the ultimate vindication, not just surviving Derek's betrayal, but transforming it into something that protected other people from similar predators. 20 years after Madison found that prescription bottle, I was preparing to retire from active consulting work, but continuing my volunteer activities with abuse survivors. Derek had been out of prison for several years, but had made no attempt to contact me, apparently focused on rebuilding his own life in another state. Rose was now a teenager who knew the basic facts of Derek's crimes, but had grown up surrounded by love and security, rather than the fear and control Derek had tried to impose on our family. "Mom, why do you think Derek did what he did?" Rose asked one day while we were working in our garden together. It was a question I'd been expecting but hadn't known how to answer. I think he was desperate and selfish, I said, choosing honesty over platitudes. He made terrible choices because he couldn't face the consequences of his other bad decisions. But what he did to me led me to work that helped a lot of people, including helping you grow up in a world where people are more aware of these kinds of crimes. Rose nodded thoughtfully. So something good came from something terrible? Yes, I said. But that doesn't make what Derek did okay. It just means that people can choose to create good things even after bad things happen to them. Rose's understanding of Derek's crimes would evolve as she got older, but I wanted her to grow up knowing that victims of abuse weren't defined by what had been done to them, but by how they chose to move forward. Madison, now in her 50s, remained my closest friend and had become something of an expert in recognizing signs of domestic abuse through her volunteer work and personal experience with my case. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that bottle? She asked during one of our regular coffee dates. I try not to think about it, I admitted, but I know Derek's plan was working. Another few months and I probably would have been declared incompetent and institutionalized while he stole everything. Madison shuddered. I still can't believe I almost didn't say anything. The bottle looked so official, and Derek was your husband. That's exactly why these crimes work, I reminded her. People trust family members and don't want to interfere in marriages. Derek was counting on that. Madison's intervention had literally saved my life and my sanity. But more than that, her willingness to speak up despite feeling awkward about questioning my husband's behavior had broken the isolation that Derek had worked so hard to create. You didn't just find evidence, I told Madison. You reminded me that I had people who cared about me and would help me. Derek had almost made me forget that. 25 years later, I was sitting in my garden watching my grandchildren play while reflecting on how different my life had become from what Derek had planned for me. Instead of being institutionalized and robbed of my inheritance, I'd used Grandma Rose's legacy to help hundreds of abuse victims, raised a daughter who understood the importance of recognizing and preventing exploitation, and built a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Derek had served his full sentence and lived quietly in another state, apparently working in construction and staying out of trouble. I occasionally wondered if he'd learned anything from his decade in prison, but mostly I didn't think about him at all. The money he tried to steal had ultimately done far more good than he could have imagined. The inheritance he'd coveted had funded services for abuse victims, supported families in crisis, and helped educate professionals about financial exploitation. Grandma Rose would have been proud to see her money used to protect vulnerable people from predators like Derek. My work had evolved over the decades, from graphic design to abuse prevention, from victim to advocate, from someone who'd been manipulated and controlled to someone who helped others recognize and resist manipulation. The cognitive effects of Derek's poisoning had largely resolved, though I still occasionally struggled with short-term memory and concentration. Those challenges had made me more patient with other survivors facing similar difficulties, and more creative in developing accessible resources for people with cognitive disabilities. The inheritance that had nearly destroyed my life had ultimately become the foundation for work that gave my life deep meaning and purpose. Derek's plan had backfired so completely that it was almost poetic. He tried to make me helpless and dependent, but his crimes had forced me to become strong and independent. He'd tried to steal my future, but had instead connected me with work that made the future better for other people. The woman Derek had tried to destroy no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Someone who understood both the devastating effects of betrayal and the healing power of using trauma to help others. That transformation felt like the truest victory over Derek's attempt to control and diminish me. He'd failed not just to steal my inheritance, but to steal my capacity for growth, connection, and contribution to the world. The prescription bottle Madison found that Sunday morning had been intended as evidence of Derek's control over me. Instead, it became evidence of his crimes and the beginning of my journey toward a life more meaningful than anything I'd imagined before his betrayal. In the end, Derek's attempt to poison me had made me stronger. His effort to steal my inheritance had led me to use it more purposefully. His plan to destroy my life had instead helped me build something better. That felt like justice enough.